So thanks again for joining us today. My name is Meg Gasnov. I'm the manager of Brighter Spark Applied Research at Spark, a Center for Social Research Innovation at McMaster University. And today we're very fortunate to have Jonathan Obar join us today. And his Spark talk is titled Privacy and the Biggest Lie on the Internet. So I'm very captivated by your title here, Jonathan. Before we get into that, I do want to just start by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations, who are the traditional inhabitants of the land where McMaster University stands. And to say that is to acknowledge a debt to those who are here before us and to recognize our responsibility as guests on the land to respect and honor the intimate relationship that Indigenous peoples have on this land. Today, we are fortunate to have Dr. Jonathan Obar, who is an associate professor at York University in the Department of Communication and Media Studies. Dr. Obar's research and teaching focus on information and communication policy, big data and privacy, network neutrality, and digital activism. And he's had some recent publications on privacy, online consent, and corporate transparency. With some funding from the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, Dr. Obar recently launched a website called www.thebiggestlieonline.com, and it's a knowledge mobilization site to engage stakeholders in online privacy research. So very excited to have you join us today, Dr. Obar, and turning it over to you.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen 1 second. All right, well, good morning, everyone. Well, first of all, thank you for the land acknowledgement, and thank you to the organizers, to Lynn, to Meg, to Allison, and to the others on the team for the invitation and this opportunity, and thank you to all of you for attending today. The title of my talk is Privacy Online and the Biggest Lie on the Internet. One thing I often say when I give a talk is, I hope that you see this talk as the beginning of a conversation as opposed to the end of a conversation. You know, sometimes a talk finishes and it's like, well, I never need to think about that ever again, or whatever. I really hope that you see this as the beginning of a conversation and that you find the work I'm going to be talking about today useful in your own area of expertise, as well as perhaps in your own life away from work when you're engaging with digital services. So I've included my Twitter handle there, as well as the URL biggestlieonline.com. This is a knowledge mobilization site meant to engage stakeholders like yourselves in meaningful online consent research. Feel free to look through the site as I'm talking today. I hope that you'll share the site and the resources with colleagues, with friends. Feel free to post on social media if you feel the work is useful. You know, if you're teaching classes on online privacy, there's materials there, including video essays we worked very hard on about things like click wrap agreements and data sharing and things like that. So yeah, again, I hope that you see this as the beginning of a conversation, you find this work useful. Please message me, let me know if you have further questions after the talk. I'll just mention that some of this work I'm talking about today has been funded by the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. The views expressed in this talk are my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the funder. So the plan. We'll start with, like as academics often do, with a definition of what we're going to be talking about. What is the biggest lie on the internet? Just so it's sort of clear where we're going. What is a click wrap anyways? What is this term that Jonathan just used? As well as some context, some background for, you know, so what? Why are we talking about this? Why are we researching this? Why should we care about this? And then I will basically be talking about the research I've been doing for the last few years, aiming to unpack the biggest lie on the internet. Why is this happening? Why is it a problem? One thing I should mention before we proceed, because I'm planning not only to speak about the studies, but to engage you in some of the knowledge mobilization resources we've put on biggestlyonline.com. At different points during the talk, I'm going to be posting a YouTube link in the chat, and you'll have an opportunity to view the YouTube link sort of on your own screen for a minute or two or a couple minutes, and I'll provide information about that as we proceed. All right, so definition. I have the chat open here. What is the biggest lie on the internet? Does anybody want to answer this question? Does anybody want to guess? What have you heard is the biggest lie on the internet? So I'm just looking at the chat to see if anyone wants to jump in. Right. Well, feel free to give the answer that the talk is about if you'd like. Right. Yeah. No, I guess it was on the poster. That's right. No, the interesting thing about the biggest lie on the internet is for more than a decade, if you typed the biggest lie on the internet into Twitter or Instagram or any social media outlet or into Google, you'd find all sorts of answers to the question. The biggest lie on the internet is an internet meme that's been going around the internet for many years. But fairly consistently, it's been argued that I agree to the terms and conditions is referred to as the biggest lie on the internet. And this suggests a considerable problem with what we call the notice and consent privacy framework that's central to privacy law throughout the world. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. I agree to the terms and conditions is referred to as the biggest lie on the internet. So to help us further define this internet meme, I thought what we would do, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, is watch a 1-minute YouTube video that our team organized, helping to define this term. So I'm just going to post this slide here for those watching like the recording. And in the chat, I'm just going to post this link. So what you can do, please make sure your microphones are off so we don't have lots of videos playing at the same time in the audio. And just feel free to load the YouTube video. It's about a minute long. You can watch the whole video, please. And then we'll come back in about 2 minutes and keep going. Just a few more seconds. Have people had a chance to watch the video? I'm looking at the chat. I see some reactions. Oh, thanks so much. Yeah, again, these are meant for people to share, to use in class. I hope you find this work useful if you're teaching about online privacy. All right, so let's get back to the talk. So again, defining our terms, the biggest lie on the internet. This is an internet meme, a contentious internet meme that's been going around the internet for more than 10 years. I agree to the terms and conditions is referred to as the biggest lie on the internet. Now, the arguably most contentious component of this meme is the notion of the lie. I've debated this with legal scholars who say, well, it's not really a lie if people are agreeing in this way. But the assertion is, how can you be truthful? How can you actually be agreeing to something that you've never accessed, read, or understood, right? Referring to the terms of service and privacy policies we're agreeing to all the time, right? And for privacy advocates, we often talk about understanding, right? How can you agree to something that you haven't accessed, read, or understood? When we refer to understanding, we're not just talking about understanding the words on the page, but also the implications of agreement, right? What could happen if you're agreeing to these terms of service and privacy policies? So that's the lie component. What about biggest? Well, the biggest lie, this comes from the omnipresence, the ubiquity of digital services that we're engaging with all the time, right? Just look at your phone and look at all the apps that you have there, on your computer, all the apps and programs there when you're walking in spaces and there are surveillance cameras, right? We are entering into agreements with digital service providers all the time, whether we're aware of this or not. And it's not just the apps that we see, but also the internet service providers we're working with, the transit providers, marketers, data brokers. We are entering into all sorts of agreements all the time. And that's why it's arguably the biggest lie on the internet. So I thought that I would present an argument. Sometimes, again, you get to the end of a talk and it's like, what just happened? So I typically like to present my argument, and then I'll summarize this at the end. The argument that I'm making today is that the biggest lie on the internet, this internet meme, suggests consent-based privacy protections are not working. Now, I certainly am a strong supporter of the notice and consent framework. I feel that consent-based privacy protections need to be strengthened, especially in AI-driven contexts. But the biggest lie on the internet suggests that there's a considerable problem or set of problems going on here. And my research suggests that some of the reasons this is happening, when we unpack the biggest lie on the internet, is that boring, long, and complex terms of service, as well as deceptive click wrap agreements, we'll talk about click wraps more soon, are concerns to address. And the fact that these boring, long, and complicated terms of service and deceptive click wraps are still problems suggest lackluster self-regulation by companies, a lack of leadership. And we need a lot more leadership, both by policymakers who can address this lackluster self-regulation, and the companies, the digital service providers themselves, to solve these problems. So again, just to complete some of the definitions here, this is, as you saw in the video, an example of a click wrap. We often see this user interface design or set of designs when we download an app on our phones. You'll also see them on web browsers, especially when you're signing up for a service. This is from Twitter. You'll typically have prompts like at the top there for entering some personal information, and then below you'll have, often as part of the design, this very enticing sign up button. And then below or around the button, you'll see links to policies. And by clicking the button, right, as it says below the button, by signing up, you agree to the policies. And should you actually go to the policies, what do they look like? They are contracts, right? Typically with lots of texts. Some have other things to try and make the text easier to engage with. But these are the notice tools that we're going to primarily be talking about today. Policies, terms of service and privacy policies, and click wraps. So what? Why does any of this matter, right? Why study this? Why does the problems associated with the notice and consent framework matter? And by the way, if you have questions about like what is the notice and consent framework, we're only talking about it briefly today. I certainly can answer those questions later. So about 10 years ago, President Obama's administration put out this report called Big Data: Seizing Opportunities, Preserving Values. And in that report, they stated quite clearly, big data analytics have the potential to eclipse long-standing civil rights protections in how personal information is used in housing, credit, employment, health, education, and the marketplace. Raising a considerable set of concerns more than 10 years ago, and much has been written since then, confirming these concerns, right? The possibility that data-driven, AI-driven, automated decision-making could lead to what could be referred to as big data discrimination or algorithmic discrimination. And let's be clear, the research continues to show considerably that members of marginalized and vulnerable groups are most likely to be harmed by these forms of discrimination. So these are considerable concerns. Call them civil rights concerns, certainly, civil liberties concerns. There are many concerns associated with data-driven decision-making, in AI and big data contexts. And the problems emerge often due to various data practices, data collection, data management, data use, data sharing, data retention, which will vary depending upon the organization or set of organizations engaging in these practices, which could then lead to, through algorithmic processes, what's called automated decision-making for the purpose of eligibility determinations, ranking people based on how an organization wants to select between individuals. And as has been written extensively in the literature, whether it's the algorithms, whether it's the data sets, or whether it's the people that are interpreting the results of the analytics, we're seeing the potential for discrimination due to problematic algorithms, problematic data sets, and problematic people who are ranking people based on who should arguably be eligible to get into university, to get a loan at the bank and at what rate, to get insurance and at what rate, and who would get promoted at their job, who should cross the border, who should be stopped by the police. There are differences in terms of the seriousness of the potential for discrimination in each of these contexts. It's not all the same. Eligibility determinations also occur in contexts like, should you receive a coupon or not, from a marketer. So discrimination can happen in all different situations. And so this is a considerable set of concerns. Privacy is asserted as a form of protection in this space. But how do we protect our online privacy? How do we stop the potential for discrimination, big data and AI-driven discrimination from happening? And certainly if you have questions about how this might happen and how we can stop it, we can certainly talk about this more later. In the academic literature, it's asserted that privacy protective behaviors, these are actions people can take to try and achieve privacy, are strategies for addressing these potential concerns that I've been talking about. And there are all sorts of privacy protective behaviors that are discussed and tested in the literature. You may be familiar with some of them, right? Trying to opt out, which is a considerable problem, right? Trying to be anonymous, using a VPN, hiring reputation management services, engaging in your own reputation management online, being careful what services you join, being careful what you post, posting certain things, not posting other things, being careful about what your friends post, and on and on and on. There are lots of different privacy protective behaviors, but it's asserted via the centrality of notice and consent, the notice and consent framework throughout the world, that reading and understanding terms of service and privacy policies and other notice manifestations before consenting is the most fundamental protection, information protection that there is. So just to clarify, what is notice and consent? Notice and consent means first, provide people notice, provide people with information about what they're engaging with, about the service that they're potentially going to be using and the data stuff that might occur as a result, right? And with that information, people can then consider whether or not they want to consent or not. This arguably puts people on the front lines of their own information protections. And this is the reason that policymakers around the world assert that the notice and consent framework is fundamental to information protections. This is the best strategy that we have. And it's the reason that in privacy law around the world, you'll see the notice and consent framework central, right? Front and center. Even in current deliberations on the future of AI related privacy law in Canada, notice and consent is now, it continues to be front and center. The problem is that the biggest lie on the internet suggests that the notice and consent framework is not working, right? So this fundamental strategy for delivering information protections, the best strategy that we have for achieving privacy in the context of the possibility of AI-driven discrimination is not working. And so that's the so what. So let's get to the research. Our work aims to unpack this contentious internet meme, right? What is the biggest lie on the internet, and why is it happening? And if we unpack it thoroughly through empirical study, perhaps then we can get to strategies for solving these problems. The first study. Again, we want to assess the extent to which the biggest lie on the internet is actually a thing, and this is occurring. So we asked, to what extent do university students ignore social media policies? So this was our first study conducted. I ran the study with Professor Ann Oldorf-Hirsch from the University of Connecticut. So what we did, this is what we call an experimental survey. We created the front page of a fake social network called Name Drop. Drop that name, get that job. It was meant to be a potential competitor to LinkedIn. And we designed the front page to look a lot like LinkedIn's front page, of their site at the time, including like the visuals and the click wrap in the middle. There you see, right, the prompts for some personal information, the appealing join button, and links to policies beneath. Via university-approved deception, right, university ethics approved our deception, we told participants, more than 500 undergraduates, that they would be user testing the site, right, to see what it was like, how it worked. But what we actually did was assess their engagement or the extent of their engagement with a fake sign-up process. There was both a privacy policy and a terms of service. The privacy policy could be read if you wanted to access it by clicking one of the buttons in the survey, or you could agree to it and skip it, like not access it, similar to like how a lot of click wraps work, by selecting another button via basically a click wrap. All participants had to read the terms of service. So what did we find? 543 participants in the study who read the privacy policy. 74% of our participants chose the click wrap and agreed to the privacy policy without accessing it or reading it. 26% did access the privacy policy, which was almost 8,000 words. And based on our assessment of average adult reading speed, based on what the literature says, it should have taken about 30 minutes to read the 8,000 words. Our findings suggest that the average reading time was 74 seconds for the privacy policy, with a median time of 14 seconds. And we argue that, while both of these figures are problematic, the 14-second median time is probably a better description of what actually was going on, because there were some outliers which arguably skewed the average. But whether it's 14 seconds or a minute for 8,000 words, what are people doing? They're doing this, right? Does it sound familiar? They're getting to the bottom of the policy as quickly as possible to arguably click accept. And 97% accepted the policy. So that was the privacy policy. All participants had to access the terms of service. As you see there, it required 16 minutes to read. It was more than 4,000 words long. Again, similar method of calculating how long it would take to read. The findings, again, were similar. 51-second average reading time, median of 14 seconds. 93% agreed to the policy. Remember that number. 93% agreed to our terms of service. We had what we call gotcha clauses in the terms of service. These are extreme problematic clauses. We're trying to get people's attention to see if they're reading or not. And we had two ways of assessing whether they could identify these gotcha clauses. One was whether they agreed to the policy, and 93% agreed. We also asked people after they finished reviewing the terms of service and agreed to it or not, did you notice anything problematic about these terms? 98% could not identify gotcha clauses. So we'll come back to this gotcha clause issue and describe the implications in a second. We asked people about click wraps. Remember we were talking about click wraps before? What do you think about them? Participants said, we love them. More click wraps, please. Click wraps make this boring process of going through a sign-up process simple, easy, convenient. One person even said it expedites the problem. So people like click wraps a lot. What else did people say about click wraps and the consent process? Boring, right? It's a hassle to deal with a massive amount of boring pages about privacy when the site you're joining is there to do something much more interesting, right? So this notice and consent process, which is supposed to be fundamental to delivering information protections, is being viewed by participants as being extremely boring when there's something much more interesting you could be doing. My friends are in there. My friends use this social media. In order to catch up with their life, I sign up for this as quickly as possible. And I'm in a hurry to use the service anyway. So the speed associated with sign up is also something we find very interesting. We'll talk about that in a second. And for those of you that are interested in the political economy here, right, the critical cultural component here, one participant said, it feels like a cultural norm not to read terms of service. And I'm too lazy to read them in detail. In our work, I'm a critical cultural scholar. We do connect, work by Herbert Marcuse and other Frankfurt School scholars to what we're seeing here. We do need a lot more critical cultural scholarship in spaces like this. And when people are saying things like, I'm essentially being trained to ignore to the benefit of for-profit service providers, we see concerns. This suggests that people want to enjoy the ends of digital production without being inhibited by the means. I'll say again, people want to enjoy the ends of digital production without being inhibited by the means. People are not looking for a privacy education or a discussion that's distracting, when they're accessing digital service. Notice equals nuisance. When people download their social networking app, they're there to social network. When people download their game, right? Their friends are waiting for them. They want to download their game, right? When you download the Uber app, the Uber Eats app, and people are hungry, right, and waiting for the food, like you want to eat. This is not a time for people necessarily to be reading 8,000 words or more and trying to figure out what to do. When people download their shopping or their banking app, these are the things that people want to do. They want to shop or they want to engage in online banking. People want to enjoy the ends of digital production without being inhibited by the means. And this is a problem, again, because notice and consent is so important for privacy protections. So remember those gotcha clauses? Some implications. I'm just going to skip one slide in the interest of time. Here, I'll post this. Well, actually, maybe I'll just go over it quickly. I don't want to skip it too much. All right, so some of the gotcha clauses that we included. The first set these were all in the terms of service. Again, 93% of people agreed to the terms of service. 98% of more than 500 people could not identify any problematic gotcha clauses. We included data sharing gotcha clauses. Remember I was talking about the potential for AI-driven discrimination? So one of the gotcha clauses people agreed to was name drop may be required to share data with the National Security Agency in the United States. People didn't really seem to see this was a problem. Name drop may also choose to share data with third parties to assess eligibility. And it also said something like, name drop will not be responsible if this leads to problematic eligibility determinations in the financial sector. People agreed to this. We're working a lot with anecdotes in work like this. And people were saying as we were designing the study, people would give away their firstborn child with all their agreeing to with these policies. So we included a firstborn child clause. By agreeing to these terms of service in exchange for service, all users of the site agree to immediately assign, name drop their firstborn child. And if users don't yet have children, this agreement will be enforceable until the year 2050, no exceptions. So 93% of more than 500 participants agreed to give us their children to user test a site. This is a considerable problem. It suggests, again, people are not reading, and we can talk about like what this says about the future of the notice and consent framework. I should mention that Professor Oldorf-Hirsch and I recently published a newer version of this study. The study I'm talking about now is of undergraduates. We recently published a study in the International Journal of Communication of participants aged 50 plus to see if older adults would have similar results. And I'll just briefly say the results were very similar. People like click wraps, people are skimming and reading very quickly, or not reading at all. We substituted the child assignment clause with an organ donation clause, and more than 80% of people agreed to give us organs to user test the site. So this is a problem. So why is this happening? In both studies, but in the older adult study in particular, participants said things like, policies are too long and too hard to understand. These are reasons that we're not reading, arguably, or reasons that this biggest lie on the internet is happening. So to further unpack the biggest lie on the internet, we did some research assessing how long and how complicated are these policies. So one research question was, how long are the terms of service and privacy policies for digital service providers, and how complicated are these policies? To assess length, we went to, and this is through the privacy commissioner work I was talking about, we went to the websites for 70 digital services in a wide variety of sectors. We collected their terms of service and privacy policies. We collected more than just the words on the page, like when you actually just click, privacy policy, because we're really interested in getting at understanding, including the implications of agreement. So any useful links, like links to a user policy or community guidelines or definitions or transparency reporting that was linked to the privacy policy or terms of service, we also included in our numbers. So our numbers may be higher than you might see in other studies. And to assess how complicated the policies are, we use the Flesch-Kincaid grade reading level analysis, which is a commonly used metric in the literature to assess nonfiction texts. So these are, again, we looked at 70 digital services. I'm just talking about some from our sample. The rest are you can find on biggestlyonline.com and our reports there if you're interested in this work. So some of the popular apps that we looked at, they may sound familiar: Airbnb, iTunes, TikTok, WhatsApp, Spotify, Uber, Netflix. Lots and lots of words to read. So in the terms of service, Airbnb is like up 49,000 words, right? We're seeing in the majority, right, more than half, just for terms of service, more than 10,000 words. Privacy policies tend to be a bit shorter, but we're seeing, more than 10,000 words in some. Total policy words, we're seeing more than 10,000, right? This is terms of service plus privacy policies. We're seeing more than 10,000 for all of these, more than 10,000 words. Now, one thing just to note here is Professor Nissenbaum Helen Nissenbaum from Cornell Tech talks about the transparency paradox. All right, give people too much to read and they won't read. Give people too little to read and you're hiding the facts. And so even though Netflix arguably has the shortest set of policies, are they necessarily helping to get people to understanding? Long or short, it's sort of unclear at this point how this is helping to get people to understanding. And this translates to a lot of reading time. As you see there in the middle, using metrics from the academic literature I can talk to you about, there's ways to assess average adult reading speed based on each individual nonfiction text. So we have reading speeds varying, around 200 words per minute, leading to reading times of, more than an hour, in some cases, multiple hours per service, right? Airbnb is 294 minutes, iTunes 162 minutes. But one important thing here is that you're not just reading one set of policies, because if you look at all the apps on your phone, there's lots of apps that we're engaging with all the time, right? So it's 294 plus 162 plus 114 plus 98 plus 81. That's a lot of reading, a lot of time spent reading. A study from McDonald and Craner from almost 15 years ago asserted that people would have to spend 40 minutes a day, every day, reading all the policies that they need to read to engage with all the policies necessary for the services they're using. Now, how complicated? Again, using the Flisch-Kincaid grade reading metric, this assigns like a grade reading level, like grade 9, grade 10, grade 12 reading level for a nonfiction text. Anything above a grade 12 requires a college or university level education. So what are we seeing? For all of the services in this group, we're seeing more than a grade 12 education is required. And on the privacy side, with Airbnb getting up over grade 16, Spotify is 15.8, Uber is 15.1, and the privacy policy, 2 are 11.9, but basically they're all at a grade 12 or higher, essentially. So policies are long and complicated. One thing to mention as we close this portion is that reading times and difficulty don't necessarily tell the whole story, right? If you're trying to get to understanding, which is a big thing here, rereading and checking things, right, on Google, speaking to someone, you don't just read from start to finish, you may reread things, lengthens the process. The literature suggests that older and younger adults may require longer too. So that's a problem, right? It's suggesting that the numbers that we have based on so-called average adult reading speed are not necessarily even giving people enough time to get to understanding. And so the last area that we're going to talk about in the minutes that remain, almost done here, is the click wrap. So what I'd like us to do is watch the first 3 minutes of a video essay from biggestlyonline.com about click wrap agreement. All right, are we ready to start again? Need another minute or so. Okay, so let's start again. All right, great. Again, I hope you'll have the opportunity to watch the whole video. We worked really hard on it. Again, funded by the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. We also received some funding from SSHRC and York University too. So again, this hopefully helps to define what a click wrap is and some of the concerns associated with click wraps. We wanted to see how common problematic click wrap designs are. So the last study I'll be talking about just for the next few minutes, and then we'll get to some questions, hopefully. What we did was a quantitative content analysis of 50 sign-up desktop web-based click wraps. So as opposed to looking at click wraps that you might find in an app on your phone, we wanted to look at web-based click wraps from a desktop, mainly because like the screen size on a laptop or desktop computer is larger, hopefully would contribute to better functionality, more opportunities for engagement. We looked at 20 social media, 20 brick and mortar, and 10 e-commerce sites, and we content analyzed like what the design was. Is there an accept button? How big is the button, or is it something else? How large is the button? Where is it? What's the text on the button? And how are the policies presented? Is there policy text? Is there a button for the policies or a link, etc.? What did we find? What do you think that we found? We found a fairly standardized set of designs. All 50 click wraps were found to have a very colorful accept button, like you see this example, I believe, from Twitter at the bottom here. A button, right? This is a choice to make the accept button look like a button, right? And for it to be quite colorful. 38 were coded as large, again, making them prominent for the user to see. And this was something really interesting that we found. 16 of the 50 had the text create account on the button. 14 had sign up. Only 2 said agree. Now, this is a design choice, right? To basically use text that arguably isn't alerting individuals to the fact that a consent process is taking place. The buttons didn't often say agree or consent. They often said create account or sign up. So how is this distracting people from the sign up process, right? Arguably, the goal seems to be consumption or getting people through these consent processes. That's a problem. What we found was also a lot of policy links, no policy buttons. All 50 services provided links to policies. This is from Pinterest here at the bottom, right? So a lot of them look like this. Pinterest has 3 appealing buttons here. So the source here is from Pinterest.com. And then you see the links to policies there at the bottom. All 50 provided policy links. Only 1, YouTube, provided a little bit of policy text, like some summary. None of them appeared as a button. 21 of 50 had the links below the button. So just like in the video, as you're reading from top to bottom, encounter these appealing buttons first, and then the links to policies are below. And 49 of 50 had smaller link policy text than the text on the buttons, which is a problem because, again, the buttons, the agree, the sign up buttons are more prominent. So where are the digital service providers trying to direct attention? To consumption. So Professor Oldorf Hirsch and I argue that click wraps maintain flow to monetize sections of services while diverting attention from policies that might encourage dissent. And seeing this across services may actually train individuals to ignore consent processes. We're very concerned about the use of what increasingly are being called deceptive designs in user interface designs for digital services, designs that benefit service providers and their for-profit biases at the expense of users or individuals and their information protections. By maintaining flow to monetize sections of services and keeping people's attention away from opportunities for like learning about the privacy implications, how is this the most fundamental component of information protection being manifested in like these click wrap scenarios? We're arguing that this is a big problem. So to conclude our take-home points, connecting back to what the argument is for today. The biggest lie on the internet, this internet meme, suggests consent-based information protections are not working. Users often ignore terms of service for digital services. Notice equals nuisance. And Other reasons for the biggest lie on the internet: policy length and complexity may contribute to ignoring behaviors. Click wraps are also a problem, as we've just discussed, because we're finding that they align with the deceptive design literature, and this suggests that click wraps are contributing to ignoring behaviors. And we're finding this in our empirical work too. We're calling for more self-regulation and leadership by digital service providers to help us address the biggest lie on the internet. Here are my references. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. That was so fascinating. Really exciting talk. I'm wondering if anyone has any questions for Jonathan today. You can either unmute yourself or you can type it in the chat box. Dennis has a question, and it was one along the lines that I have. So what's the suggested solution to this issue?
So, well, first of all, thanks to everyone for your attention, and thanks again to the team for this opportunity. Yeah, this is a great question, and we could certainly spend a lot of time talking about it. One thing I'll mention, on the site, biggestlyonline.com, we do have a section called Discover Solutions, where I do link to some of the leading academic and advocacy efforts to try and solve some of these challenges that our work attempts to reveal. I mean, one solution, of course, is better self-regulation by companies, and perhaps enforcement by policymakers, like we're seeing, which I can talk about, to encourage leadership by digital service providers. There are all sorts of potential. I should say my work, at least the work I'm talking about today, aims to unpack the biggest lie on the internet, which is more about identifying problems than solutions. But certainly we can talk about some of the solutions. There are a variety of them. None of them seem to be working so well just yet, but I'll mention a few. There are top-down solutions, arguably top-down, from government. So we're seeing increasingly fines internationally, in the cases of more than $100 million, for deceptive consent user interfaces that arguably are improperly influencing consent scenarios. So in France, a data protection group that's affiliated with the government fined Google 100 million euros, Facebook 60 million euros, TikTok just in December of last year, 5 million euros, I believe, for problematic cookie consent scenarios. The Federal Trade Commission in the United States is also addressing problematic consent scenarios, and Bill C-27, which is currently being debated by the federal government in Canada, does include something new: fines for problematic consent processes. I have a piece in The Conversation. If interested, I can post the link that just came out this week about the possibility of top-down enforcement mechanisms, fines for companies that are engaging in deceptive or misleading consent processes in Canada. There are also bottom-up approaches that could be helped along by terms of service that are easier to read, strategies for engaging people in service terms that are different from like getting people to read 8,000-word documents. So Professor Lori Craner from Carnegie Mellon is studying the use of a nutrition label approach to privacy, especially on something like an Internet of Things device. So Alexa doesn't have a screen. So how do you know if Alexa is safe or not to use? When you walk into a mall, there's no screen alerting you to the possibility of a privacy policy that you're agreeing to, which you are when you open the door to a mall. So labels that are a new form of signage, these are also strategies. Yeah. So I see there's another question.
Yes, we did also have a comment saying, yes, please share that document you referred to.
Oh yeah, sure.
And yeah, LCS had a question here. Do you have any thoughts or comments about the issue of consent and deception and consent when we think of youth or minors as the target audience of digital tools or spaces?
Sure, I was just looking for that link. I'll share the link to the conversation piece. So there it is there. It was also republished, not to talk about myself, but it was republished in the National Post the other day as well. So I hope you find this work useful. Please share. Yeah. So sorry, consent and deception having to do with younger individuals. Yes, I mean, this is a huge problem as well, because the notice and consent framework, which again is viewed internationally as fundamental to delivering information protections, is not really designed for young individuals. And young individuals are engaging increasingly with digital services, like all the time, whether it's on the phones. Young people also walk into spaces where there are surveillance cameras, and the potential for facial recognition is taking place. So, privacy scholars have argued for a long time that just taking, like, essentially a contract and posting it on a website through what's called a browse wrap approach, which is different from click wrap. Browse wrap is like Google search typically uses browse wrap, arguably. A mall uses browse wrap. Many organizations that have websites use browse wrap. Browse wrap is where there isn't a prompt to direct your attention to a terms of service, but that terms of service is available on a website for you to review. A click wrap arguably, like, at least prompts people, like, oh, here's the link if you're interested. Browse wrap is like, people are supposed to know if they're interested in reading the policy that they're agreeing to before they use a service like a mall. They're supposed to go to the website to read the privacy policy that they're agreeing to. Browse wrap is arguably a big problem. And it's especially a problem for kids because, like, are kids aware of the fact that when they go with their friend, to a mall with friends or whatever, that they're agreeing to service terms? So this is, again, why policymakers need to do more to especially encourage better self-regulation, better leadership by companies to come up with solutions to these problems, to make it easier for people to develop understanding. Things that the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada has asserted in their guidelines for obtaining meaningful consent, which I can share the link to those guidelines if you like, or you can just Google guidelines for obtaining meaningful consent, Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. They talk about things like just-in-time notices or a more dynamic consent process. So when people just consent when they're signing up for a service, if they're not reading at that point, it's a problem to begin with. But even if they do read and are able to, and they have understanding at that point, like, what about 5 years after that point when they're using a service? Dynamic or just-in-time consent processes are continually engaging people in a consent process, not necessarily by just like, oh, by the way, you should read the policy again, but perhaps using different techniques to build what Professor Leslie Shade and Professor Tamara Shepard call digital policy literacy, right? Helping people to develop forms of digital literacy at different points through their digital engagements so that they can continue to consent or dissent if they want to, when they turn their camera on, when they access a space, and so forth, so that people are engaged in various ways. How we do this, we need to figure this out because no one's really doing this well. Meta now has video in their privacy policy as a way to support engagement. Videos that are like a minute long, right? Not long, boring videos, arguably. Google also has videos. Twitter has a game in their privacy policy. Whether the game is great or not and leads to education, I don't know. So we need better ideas to get people engaged, especially members of marginalized and vulnerable populations. Again, because as was noted earlier, these individuals are most likely to be harmed by forms of big data and AI-driven discrimination. So we need forms of, we need strategies for ensuring protections for members of these communities in particular, but also for, like, that can be helpful for anyone.
Yeah, and actually these principles can be applied to any sort of research project that we do as well, in terms of consent and ongoing consent and different ways of obtaining consent. So that is our time for today. Dr. Jonathan Obar, everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. If you do have any further questions for us at Spark, you can see our email address in the chat box there, talk.to.spark@mcmaster.ca. We also have a 1-minute feedback survey where you can provide your feedback and also give ideas for future speakers. And also our link to our website for upcoming events. And Dr. Obar has put his link in there for his website, biggestlyonline.com. So once again, thanks so much, Jonathan, and have a fantastic afternoon, everyone, and a great weekend.